I want the keys to the Range Rover and the key fob for the penthouse on my desk by 5 p.m. No exceptions. Those were the first words Julian Vance, the billionaire CEO of Vance Global, said to me after I'd spent 72 hours straight closing his failing tech merger. I was exhausted, my eyes were bloodshot, and my hands were still shaking from the third pot of coffee. I had just saved his empire from a catastrophic collapse, and his way of saying thank you was to render me homeless. Julian, the lease on that apartment is part of my executive compensation package, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. And the car is essential for the 4 a.m. airport runs I do for you. He didn't even look up from his gold-plated fountain pen. He just smirked, that condescending, sharp-edged smirk that made him look like a shark in a tailored Italian suit. Vivian, darling, look at the numbers, he sighed, gesturing to the glowing monitors on the wall. We're restructuring. To stay lean, we have to cut the fat. And right now, you're overhead. You're a liability I can no longer afford to carry while I'm trying to save a multi-billion-dollar merger. It's not personal, it's just business. You're disposable. Now the keys, please. That was the moment the switch flipped. For 6 years, I had been the ghost in his machine. I knew his allergies, his offshore accounts, his mistress's florist, and the exact shade of blue he liked his private jet's upholstery to be. I was the asset that kept his life from imploding, and he just called me disposable. I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I simply reached into my designer bag, pulled out the keys, and placed them silently on the mahogany desk. Business is business, Julian, I whispered. Exactly, he barked, already turning his chair toward the window overlooking the Los Angeles skyline. Now get out. Security will escort you to collect your personal belongings. Don't take any company pens on your way out. As I walked out of that glass tower with nothing but a cardboard box and a heart made of ice, I realized something Julian had forgotten. He was a paper tiger. He delegated everything, his schedules, his bills, his very life to people like me. He thought he was the architect, but he was just the guy living in a house built by people he treated like dirt. And unfortunately for Julian, I wasn't just his assistant, I was his auditor. While I was helping his legal team prep his upcoming, high-stakes divorce settlement, I had stumbled upon a file tucked away in a digital folder labeled Legacy Holdings, MISC. Julian thought he was a genius for hiding his $10 million Malibu estate under a complex web of shell companies to keep it away from his soon-to-be ex-wife. But hiding assets is like burying a body. If you don't do it deep enough, the smell eventually gives you away. I remembered a specific document. A notice of default from a secondary lien holder, a small, defunct business loan Julian had used to kickstart his first company a decade ago. It was for a measly $150,000. To a billionaire, that's pocket change. To Julian, it was junk mail. He had ignored the notices for months, assuming his people would handle it. But his people were me. And I was no longer on the clock. As I stood on the sidewalk watching my repossessed Range Rover being driven away by a junior intern, I pulled out my personal phone. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call a friend. I called a debt collection agency in Nevada that I knew specialized in zombie debt. Hello, I said, my voice as cold as the marble floors I'd just been kicked off of. I'm interested in purchasing a specific secondary lien on a property in Malibu. Yes. I have the case number right here. The trap wasn't just set, it was already closing. Julian wanted to liquidate my life to save his empire. Fine. I was going to buy the roof over his head for pennies on the dollar, and he wouldn't even know I owned him until the locks were changed. When I left the office that day, I didn't go to a bar to drown my sorrows. I went to a small, cramped office in a dusty corner of Nevada. The sign on the door read Legacy Asset Recoveries. It wasn't a place for billionaires, it was a graveyard for forgotten debts. I'm looking for the lien on the Malibu property held under Vance Holdings LLC, I told the agent, a man who looked like he hadn't seen sunlight since the 90s. That's a dead lead, lady, he rasped, tapping his keyboard. It's a decade-old secondary business loan, only $150,000. We've sent a dozen notices of default. The owner probably thinks it's junk mail. It's not worth our time to foreclose on a $10 million mansion for a tiny sliver of debt. It is to me, I said, sliding a check across the desk. It was my entire life savings, the money I'd spent 6 years earning by working 80-hour weeks, missing holidays, and being Julian's punching bag. I want to buy that debt right now, total assignment of rights. He looked at the check, then at me. You realize if he just pays the $150,000 before the auction date, you lose your premium? He won't, I smiled. He doesn't even know it exists. He fired the only person who checked his mail. The transaction was cold, clinical, and completely legal. For a fraction of its value, I now held a legal noose around Julian's neck. In the state of California, a non-judicial foreclosure on a secondary lien can be a legal nightmare if you don't respond to the notices. And Julian? He was too busy liquidating his staff to notice the red-inked envelopes piling up in his mansion's marble foyer. Over the next month, I watched from the shadows. I watched as Julian went on national television, bragging about his lean and mean restructuring strategy. He talked about cutting the fat and optimizing assets. Every time he said those words, I looked at the deed in my hand and whispered, "Keep talking, Julian." I knew his schedule by heart. I knew he was pushing for a massive merger with a Japanese tech giant. It was his last-ditch effort to save his reputation. He needed a clean balance sheet to impress the board. What he didn't realize was that while his corporate books were being scrubbed, his personal foundation was rotting. I began the quiet foreclosure process. No phone calls, no threats. Just the mandatory legal filings buried in the back pages of local newspapers that no one reads, except for people like me. The beauty of Julian's shell company strategy was now his downfall. Because the house was owned by a complex layer of LLCs, the legal notices didn't go to his office. They went to a registered agent in Delaware who, thanks to a clerical error I had intentionally left uncorrected before I was fired, had an outdated forwarding address. One evening, I drove past the Malibu estate. The lights were on. I could see Julian through the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, sipping a $2,000 bottle of scotch, probably congratulating himself on his genius. He had no idea that legally he was already a squatter. The 90-day window for redemption was closing. Every day that passed without him paying that tiny, forgotten loan was another nail in his coffin. I had private investors lined up, people Julian had screwed over in the past, who were more than happy to fund the final foreclosure sale. Because it was a private auction for a defaulted lien, and because Julian had effectively ghosted the legal system, there was no bidding war. There was just me, a court-appointed trustee, and a very quiet transfer of title. The day the gavel fell, I didn't feel joy. I felt a cold, hard sense of justice. $10 million worth of prime real estate. Bought for the price of a mid-sized SUV. Julian still lived there. He still parked his repossessed from me Range Rover in the garage. He still slept in the master suite. But on paper, he was homeless. And I was just waiting for the most public moment possible to hand him his restructuring notice. The day of the merger was Julian's coronation. The glass-walled boardroom of Vance Global was packed with suit-clad sharks from the Japanese tech giant and his own jittery board of directors. Julian stood at the head of the table, his chest puffed out like a peacock, a digital presentation glowing behind him. The slide on the screen read, "A lean empire. Zero liabilities." I stood outside the heavy oak doors, clutching a manila envelope. I wasn't wearing my old assistant clothes, the sensible flats and the muted blazers. I was wearing a charcoal gray power suit and heels that sounded like gunshots on the marble floor. "And that, gentlemen," Julian's voice boomed through the door, "is how you save a sinking ship, by cutting the dead weight. By liquidating the overhead that thinks it's indispensable. As of this morning, our personal and corporate balance sheets are cleaner than they've been in a decade. No debts, no anchors." I didn't knock, I just walked in. The room went silent. Julian's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before hardening into a mask of pure annoyance. "Vivian," he scoffed, not even bothered to stand up. "I thought security was told you weren't allowed on the premises." Are you here to beg for your severance? Because the window for grace closed weeks ago, the board members whispered. The Japanese executives looked confused. I didn't say a word. I just walked to the head of the table and slid the manila envelope across the polished wood, right over his zero liabilities slide. I'm not here for severance, Julian, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a razor. I'm here as a courtesy to give you the 72-hour notice the law requires before I change the locks on my new investment property. Julian laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. Your property. Vivian, you were living in a company lease studio. You don't own a bicycle, let alone property. I don't own a studio, I replied, leaning in so the entire board could see the document I pulled out. I own 1042 Ocean Breeze Way, the Malibu estate, the one you just listed on your clean balance sheet as your primary residence and a key personal asset for this merger. Julian's face went from pale to a deep, bruised purple. That's impossible. That house is held by a private LLC. It's untouchable. It was held by an LLC that defaulted on a secondary lien from 10 years ago, I corrected him, loud enough for the lead Japanese investor to lean forward. A lien you ignored, a lien I bought. The foreclosure was finalized 3 days ago, Julian. The deed was recorded this morning in my name. I turned to the board. As of 9 a.m., your CEO is technically a squatter in a house he no longer owns. And since this merger relies on his personal solvency as a guarantee, I thought you'd like to know that his empire is built on sand. The silence that followed was deafening. The lead investor stood up, looked at the deed, then looked at Julian. Mr. Vance, the investor said, his voice cold, you told us your personal holdings were secure. If you cannot even manage the paperwork for your own home, how can we trust you with our billion-dollar merger? Julian scrambled. He grabbed the papers, his hands shaking so violently he nearly ripped them. This is a trick. A clerical error. Vivian, you're fired. Again, get out. You can't fire someone who doesn't work for you, Julian, I said, turning toward the door. But you can start packing. You have 3 days to get your things out of my house. And don't worry, I've already called the same repo company you used for my car. They'll be at your driveway by noon to collect the Range Rover. After all, it's just business. As I walked out, I heard the board members start shouting. The paper tiger was being torn apart by his own pride. But the best part wasn't the boardroom. It was the fact that he still had to go home that night to a house that didn't belong to him anymore. The 72 hours were up. I arrived at the Malibu gates at exactly 10 a.m. I wasn't alone. 2 sheriff's deputies and a professional locksmith were standing behind me. The Pacific Ocean was crashing against the cliffs below, a beautiful rhythmic sound that felt like a celebration. The gates were locked. I didn't need a code. I handed the deed to the deputy, who nodded and signaled the locksmith. Within minutes, the heavy iron gates swung open, my gates. As we drove up the long, winding driveway, I saw Julian. He was standing on the front porch, his hair disheveled, a half-empty bottle of expensive bourbon in his hand. The tailored suit was gone, replaced by a wrinkled shirt. He looked small. For the first time in his life, he looked like the liability he had always accused others of being. You can't do this, Vivian, he screamed as I stepped out of the car. I've filed an injunction. My lawyers are working on this. This is my house. I built this. Your lawyers quit this morning, Julian, I said, walking up the steps. I didn't stop until I was standing right in front of him. I know, because I received their notification. They haven't been paid in 3 months. It seems your lean and mean strategy left you with no one to fight your battles. The deputy stepped forward. Mr. Vance, we have a court-ordered writ of possession. You need to vacate the premises immediately. Anything left behind after 60 minutes will be considered abandoned property. Julian looked at the deputy, then at me. The realization finally hit him. The paper tiger had no more ink. The merger had collapsed, his board had ousted him, and now even his sanctuary was gone. Where am I supposed to go? He whispered, his voice cracking. I looked at him, the man who had watched me carry my life in a cardboard box just weeks ago without a hint of remorse. The same place you sent me, Julian, I replied coldly. To the streets. Maybe you can restructure a park bench. It's not personal, it's just business. Remember? The next hour was a masterclass in karma. I watched as Julian Vance, the man who once controlled a tech empire, stuffed his designer shoes and silk shirts into trash bags. He tried to take the $50,000 watch collection from the safe, but the locksmith had already changed the combination. Those stay, I said, pointing to the watches and the art on the walls. They were technically owned by the LLC that defaulted. Since I bought the LLC's debt and the underlying assets, these belong to me now. Consider them overhead that I'm cutting. By 11 a.m., Julian was standing at the end of his own driveway, 2 trash bags at his feet. The same repo truck that had taken my car pulled up to tow his silver Ferrari. I stood on the balcony of the master suite, looking down at him. He looked up one last time, hoping for a shred of pity. I gave him nothing but a silent toast with a glass of water. As his car service, a basic Uber since his corporate accounts were frozen, pulled away, I walked inside and closed the heavy oak doors. The house was silent. For years, I had worked in these rooms as a ghost, a servant, a disposable asset. Now I was the owner. I sat down at the massive mahogany desk in the library, the same style as the one Julian used to fire me. I pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and wrote one single sentence. Accountability is the only debt that can never be liquidated. I had spent my life building other people's dreams, but today I was finally home. And the view of the ocean, it looked much better when you actually owned the windows you were looking through.